Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Greg Mankiw, the Robert M. Barron Professor of Economics at Harvard University. Greg is the author of a series of best-selling economics textbooks, the former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. He's a first-rate academic scholar and a phenomenal blogger at Greg Mankiw's blog. Greg, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Greg, when I was an undergraduate back in the 70s, which was a tough time for macro, we learned what's called ISLM analysis, a version of Keynesian economics. And in that model, the economy is like an engine. You want it to go faster, you give it more gas. You push down the pedal. So if you wanted to stimulate the economy, if it wasn't where you thought it should be, you could choose fiscal policy or monetary policy. And as students, we were always shifting curves and finding out where the economy was going to get to after we implemented these policy changes. Then I went off to graduate school, and I never saw that again. Part of that was where I went to graduate school, University of Chicago, but part of it was that there was a great deal of research that was done and study that made people skeptical of the ability to fine-tune the economy. What do you think is the state of Keynesian economics and the Keynesian model, that stimulus response model, in undergraduate and graduate education today?
Well, I think the Keynesian model is actually quite alive and well. We certainly have a degree of skepticism greater than was the case back in the 60s and 70s, in part because of the work of Milton Friedman and Robert Lucas, two very important Nobel Prize-winning economists. But in the past 20 years, there's been actually resurgence of interest in Keynesian models. I have an intermediate-level macroeconomics textbook that still teaches the ISLM model, the model that you referred to. And if you look at sort of the research going on today, pioneered by people like Mike Woodford, the basic framework of the ISLM model is very much there in the background. Keynesian economics probably went through a low in sort of the late 70s when Robert Lucas was proclaiming the death of Keynesian economics. But while Keynesian economics may have been on life support, it wasn't dead, and I think it actually made quite a good recovery in the past 20 years.
When I was an undergraduate, one of the ways that you solved an economy's doldrums, and I don't know if it's still true, and I apologize, I haven't read your textbook lately on ISLM, but one of the ways you solved it was you ran a deficit, and that was going to stimulate the economy. Now, we've been running a deficit for quite a long time in the United States, roughly 30-something years, with maybe 1 or 2 years of 1 year of surplus on an annual basis.
Right, yes, it's a brief time in the late 90s.
A naive interpretation of that would be, that's why the economy's been growing so well. We're running all those deficits, and if we stop doing that, the economy's not going to work as well. That would certainly be a bad way to look at the world, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. No, I don't think anyone would think that the main reason we've seen tremendous growth over the past 30 years has to do with Keynesian demand side phenomenon. It has to do with the fact that we've had tremendous technological advance and a good market economy that's flourished. The phenomena that Keynes tried to emphasize was that in the short run, the amount of demand for goods and services could affect the level of utilization, level of unemployment, and that tools of monetary and fiscal policy can affect the aggregate demand for goods and services, and therefore have short-run effects on unemployment and real GDP. But I don't think anyone today thinks those are long-lived phenomena. So deficit finance could for a while stimulate the economy, but over the longer run, the world looks much more classical than Keynesian, and as a result, what deficits do, if anything, is crowd out capital accumulation and reduce economic growth.
When you say classical, what do you mean?
Well, classical meaning that the ideas going back to before Keynes, in the longer run, over the period of say a decade or so, the vision of Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the 18th to 19th century economists, is probably the right one. And Keynes, I think, the great 20th century British economist, really gave us tools to understand short-run fluctuations, but those short-run fluctuations are the phenomena that last only a few years.
And there was a great deal of emphasis in the 60s and 70s on building elaborate statistical models of different sectors of the economy and trying to combine them. Where do you think those models stand in terms of the respect that the profession has?
Well, I think as an academic matter, people have become much more skeptical of those, in part because a lot of the critiques that Robert Lucas and Milton Friedman put forward in the 60s and 70s. On the other hand, there hasn't really been a substitute for them.
Yeah,
so if you're at the Federal Reserve trying to decide, should I raise interest rates or lower interest rates in order to come with the optimal balance between inflation and unemployment, there's really no tool that comes out of the Friedman-Lucas theoretical endeavor. So what they're really left with is a set of models that aren't that different from the kind of models that people were building in the 60s and 70s. They've been modernized and retooled and re-estimated, but monetary policy is still very much based on traditional Keynesian models of the sort that economists Larry Klein and Franco Bodigliani were building 4 years ago.
So you think the Fed actually looks at those?
Absolutely.
Is that a speculation?
They look at them. Now, so the only thing they look at, and I think there's differing degrees of skepticism about those models in different circles. My guess is Alan Greenspan was probably more skeptical than most central bankers because he did not come from a sort of academic background. My guess is Ben Bernanke probably looks at them a little bit more. But I think all smart central bankers take them with a grain of salt. It's one thing they look at, but
Sure.
hardly the only thing they look at.
Going back to Keynes for a minute, one of the stranger ideas for me, and I'm curious your impression of it, is the Keynesian multiplier. And it comes back to this deficit stimulus idea. And I think a lot of non-economists, a lot of everyday folk, have a very good idea of what's meant by that multiplier. The idea that if government spends money, that money is received by somebody, and then the recipients spend it, and the recipients of that spending spend it. And in that model, which is used all the time to justify various government programs, particularly at the state and local level, those models often neglect, as did some of my undergraduate models, where the money comes from to start with. That it either comes from taxpayers in the form of taxes or from future taxpayers if it's done by borrowing. And those models often ignored the behavioral impact that those taxes and borrowing would have. What do you think the state of our understanding is of that effect, of the multiplier, the so-called multiplier? Do you agree with me?
Yes, the multiplier is one of the great sort of Keynesian ideas. I think when people start looking at it, there's sort of two very important caveats. One is it's only a short-run phenomenon, so it's not going to work to stimulate the economy over a longer period of time. So we're talking about something that's only going to work over a period of a few years, which is the time horizon in which the Keynesian aggregate demand effects matter. And the second is that when you actually go to the data and actually estimate the size of these multipliers, they turn out not to be all that big, it looks like. So even if Keynes was right as a matter of theory, as a matter of practice, these multiplier effects may not be all that large. And over the longer horizon, which the Keynesian model is less important, and which these more classical ideas of Smith and Marshall and Ricardo are more important. Over that horizon, then when the government spends money, it's just crowding out one for one something that the private sector would do, and if to the extent it's using distortionary taxes to fund that, it could be even worse than crowding out one for one, because it's going to shrink the size of the economic pie through higher distortionary taxes.
Let's go into that in a little more detail. You say crowding out some activity one for one. What do you mean by that?
Well, if the government spends $1 to buy some goods and services produced by the economy, well, the economy has finite resources, finite amount of capital and labor, and as a result, that dollar of resources has to come from somewhere else. And depending on how it's financed and a variety of other details, it could come out of private consumption, it could come out of private investment. But that dollar of resources is not created out of whole cloth. It's usually reducing spending somewhere else in the economy. Now, it could even be worse than $1 dollar crowding out. If that dollar of government spending is financed by higher tax rates, then discourage people from working, discourage people from accumulating capital. It could be the case that a dollar of government spending is actually going to reduce
the size of the
total size of the economic pie.
Yeah. One of the responses I think that the advocates of those kind of policies often make is that, well, that would be true if the economy were at full employment or if capital utilization was 100%, but it never is. There's always slack. What's your reaction to that argument?
Well, the economy needs some degree of slack. You're never going to operate an economy at 100% employment. That is, some firms are expanding, some are shrinking. When firms are shrinking, people get laid off and have to take some time to look for new jobs. So there is that sort of normal level of slack in the economy, what Milton Friedman termed the natural rate of unemployment. So when you think about the economy being fully employed, you shouldn't think of full employment as meaning 100% employment, zero unemployment. You should think of full employment as being a sort of a normal or natural level of unemployment to accommodate the fact that there's this turnover and people are going to will optimally take time to look for jobs. And when one job disappears, it doesn't make sense to take the first job that you find. It makes sense to look around and see what your best options are. And as a result, there will be some normal level of unemployment, even in a fully employed economy.
One of the ways that the intuition behind this multiplier idea, which again I think is somewhat pernicious, it sort of promises a free lunch that often disappears, is in the way that we talk about tax cuts. I think it's very hard for politicians and many pundits to keep straight the incentive effects versus the distributional effects of tax cuts. And they often sell tax cuts as a Keynesian multiplier of sorts, that somehow tax cuts inject money into the economy. But of course, the resources have to come from other taxpayers or future taxpayers, which in turn induces effects. It would really be nice if advocates of tax cuts or critics would keep in mind the role of tax rates as prices rather than as generators of flows of income. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, tax policy is complicated because there are different effects over different horizons. During the most recent tax cuts, the economy was struggling to recover from a recession, and as a result, a lot of the rhetoric about tax policy involves sort of short-run Keynesian effects to try to stimulate demand in order to get us out of the recession. But once the economy approaches sort of normal levels of employment, then you don't want to think about these Keynesian demand-side effects. You want to think about the effects on incentives and the effects on the government's present value budget constraint, and think about how it's going to affect people's incentives to work, people's incentives to accumulate capital. And you have to realize there are no free lunches. That the more one redistributes income, for example, the higher tax rates are going to be, the less incentives they're going to be, and the smaller the size of the economic pie that we'll end up with.
Well, let's switch gears for a second and talk about deficits generally. One of the things I spend a lot of time doing when I'm on an airplane talking to a stranger is trying to explain to them why it's okay for the U.S. government to run a deficit, at least in principle. Do you worry about deficits? Do you think the size of the budgetary deficit is something to be worried about?
Well, I'm not worried about the current size of the deficit, which is sort of modest by historical standards, and the current deficit is certainly, if it stayed at this size, would be sustainable, definitely, given economic growth. What I'm worried about in current fiscal policy is the long-term projection. Because the long-term projection has spending, especially on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, skyrocketing as the baby boom generation retires and draws on these programs, and as healthcare costs continue rising. These programs will continue to grow as a percentage of GDP. Tax revenue is roughly stable as a percentage of GDP, and as a result, deficits are going to become unsustainably large unless there's a change in current law. So I'm worried about deficits, not where they are now, but worried about the deficits that could arise if nothing happens going forward over the next 10, 20 years. Now, something's going to happen. We're not going to. These programs can't continue to grow at this level of taxation. So either the the benefits are going to be reined in, spending is going to slow the growth of spending, or taxes are going to go up to, say, levels we see in Western Europe. I'd personally rather see reform done on the spending side, but it's just a big challenge, and that's the part of fiscal policy that does concern me.
Yeah, I worry about that too, although the spending cuts, which are politically unpalatable today, will be more palatable if the economy continues to grow. When we have more resources, the tax increases will be more palatable as well. I just find it strange that people are complaining about the political system not solving that problem today. The incentives aren't there to solve it today for today's politicians, and the tools to solve it today aren't really there to put money aside in any real sense at the federal level.
Right. And I think that's one thing that President Bush learned when he tried to do Social Security reform, that there was not a big political incentive for politicians today to take this on. But I'm not so concerned that they make a change in the program as they affect people right today. In fact, my guess is that they couldn't politically. But what I think they can do is put into place a path of future policy changes that would sort of rein back some of the promises we're now making. Because the problem is that if you go to somebody who's now, say, 30 or 40 years old, you can tell him, we would like you to work a few years longer, or we'd like you to save a little bit more to fund your retirement. But if you don't tell him that now, when he turns 60, it's going to be hard to tell him at that point, by the way, we'd like you to work a few years longer.
Right. Exactly. What do you think of, having been in the trenches in Washington, D.C., what do you think about the state of the budgetary process and how that interacts with the deficit? It's a very strange world for those of us on the outside. There's an impression, I don't know if there's any evidence for it, there's an impression that the size of the deficit, as you say, not so worrisome at current levels as a percentage of the whole economy, but that the deficit itself does rein in the spending impulses of Congress and the president, and that's a good way to do it. It's a very strange way to do it. It's a very bizarre constraint because it's not firm in any real sense. In what sense is there any budget constraint for government today other than a feeling that, if the deficit gets too big, it's bad?
That's a very good question and a very hard one. Economic theory tells us there's basically one budget constraint that government faces, which is a present value budget constraint. The present value of spending is tied down to the present value of tax revenue. But that's not how decisions are made. Decisions are made on a year-by-year basis, and it's very hard to see how that present value infinite horizon budget constraint plays itself out through the political process. There is probably more focus in Washington on the current cash flow budget deficit than economic theory could justify. That may not be a bad thing, given that the political process is not good at dealing with present values.
Yeah.
But it's clearly a very different way of thinking about the problem than our models tell us is appropriate.
Yeah, it's a very. I'm skeptical of hard and fast rules in certain settings. Obviously you want some flexibility to borrow when you're an individual, and you want government to have the flexibility to borrow in times of crisis. But for borrowing to be the modus operandi, the sort of standard way of doing things in day-to-day life for government, strikes me as not a very healthy political economy.
I think that's probably right.
Now, in recent weeks, you've been involved in a little controversy about tax rates and deficits, based on your history as a advisor to the president and then as a scholar trying to estimate the impact of tax rates. For some reason, this has something to do with the Laffer curve, which is to me a self-evident fact that it's imaginable that if you raise taxes high enough, you could cut them and raise more money. But whether we're near that point in practice is obviously just an empirical question. What have you done in your research on this topic? What have you found? And what about whether tax cuts, quote, pay for themselves, close quote. And what's the controversy that's going on now in Washington?
I wrote a paper. I guess the project started a few years ago and has just recently been published with Matthew Weinzierl, who's a grad student at Harvard. And what Matthew and I did was we looked at a very standard model of economic growth and asked the question of to what extent, when one cuts taxes, do they generate growth and pay for part of the static cost of that tax cut? And this issue in Washington goes by the name of dynamic scoring, because when you're trying to estimate the cost of a tax change, to score the cost of a tax change, to what extent do you get revenue feedback effects coming through the dynamics of economic growth?
Through the incentives of lower tax rates, right?
That's right. So we have lower tax rates, which would stimulate saving and work effort, and that in turn would mean larger GDP. And so what we did, we took what was a very standard model of economic growth, the one that's taught in all graduate schools across the country, and said, okay, in this model, if we calibrate it with very standard parameter values taken from the literature, how much feedback do you get through economic growth? And what we found was that for a cut in labor taxes, say a payroll tax cut, that about 17% of the static revenue loss was paid for through a larger GDP in the long run. If you cut taxes on capital, say a dividend tax cut or corporate tax cut, then about half of the revenue loss was recouped through higher economic growth. And for an income tax cut, which is a combination of labor taxes and capital taxes, it'd be about a quarter is paid for through higher economic growth. Now, to my surprise, this paper has been picked up by both people on the right and people on the left as supporting their positions. It's been slightly surreal to sort of watch how people react. People on the right have said, see, we told all along that lower tax rates are good for economic growth, and this confirms what we've been saying. And people on the left said, see, we've been telling you the tax cuts don't pay for themselves. You only get something between 17 and 50% feedback. That's not, these things. Tax cuts are not self-financing. So we've had both conservative and liberal commentators sort of cite our paper as support for their position, which I think is, at least to me, has been slightly humorous.
The paper is available on the web. It's a very technical paper.
It's available on the web. It's been published in the Journal of Public Economics, which is a academic journal aimed at other nerdy economists like myself.
Right. It's not light reading for those people who have a casual interest in tax policy, but the findings are very interesting, and a thoughtful person would understand that tax cuts, I should say, I try to be careful when I talk about tax cuts, changes in tax rates,
right,
as opposed to, say, just charging people less money, having them pay less to the government. Those are two very different things. Sending a smaller check to the government is not the same as your income being taxed at a lower rate. Taxing your income at a lower rate may result in you sending a smaller check to the government, but it's the incentive effects of that we're interested in as economists. So what you found is that the incentive effects could be quite large, particularly for capital gains tax rate changes, but of course, given the current level of tax rates and the current estimates of responsiveness of people to these incentives, they're not a free lunch. They're just not quite as expensive as you might have thought. Is that a good way to summarize it?
That's precisely correct.
What's missing from the current debate, unfortunately, from my perspective, and I'd like to hear what you think, is not a reduction in taxes, but a change in tax structure. Because the real issue isn't let's cut taxes, shouldn't be, let's cut taxes 10%. The real issue is there a way of raising the money we currently raise via the current tax structure? Is there a way to raise that same amount of revenue with a more effective, less destructive mechanism? We have this incredible hodgepodge of different kinds of taxes. We have payroll taxes. We have and not just straight payroll tax. We have weird Social Security and then regular withholding, and then we've got capital gains and dividends and all the complexity. If we lowered tax rates but changed the things we taxed, we could raise the same amount of money in a more effective way, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the basic mantra for tax reform is broaden the base, lower the rates. And that was done very successfully in 1986, and that reform has slightly unraveled over time. There was another attempt at that recently with the president appointed a panel to examine fundamental tax reform that reported, I think, about 2 years ago now. They included two very prominent economists. One is Eddie Lazier, who's now chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and the other is Jim Paterba, prominent public finance economist at MIT. As well as a variety of other people from different walks of life, including some from the political process. And they put out a very credible document talking about how, given where we are now, you could continue to broaden the base and lower tax rates and move towards a better tax system. The problem is that doing that, you would quickly run into a lot of political obstacles. I mean, there are a variety of deductions that are very popular politically that economists would be very happy to scale back. So, for example, the state and local tax deduction, I think, is a very strong case to be made for eliminating that. There's no particular reason that people in high tax states should get subsidized relative to people in low tax states by the federal government. The mortgage interest deduction is another deduction that's politically very popular, and the panel proposed scaling that back quite dramatically. But
it sells like hotcakes, doesn't it?
Yeah,
people
exactly.
love getting rid of that.
Economists love the idea of scaling back that deduction, but as far as I can tell, the realtors of America and most homeowners are not so fond of the idea. And another is the exclusion of employer-provided health insurance. Mm-hmm. And I understand the Bush administration is thinking about taking that on to some extent. There was an article just in yesterday's Wall Street Journal talking about how that's being looked at inside the administration. And certainly I know there are people like Al Hubbard in the administration who have written about that in the past. And a lot of economists have suggested that we have too much employer-provided health insurance, that insurance is too comprehensive, there's not enough being paid out of pocket because we're subsidizing employer-provided health insurance through the tax system.
It's no doubt true. And I think one of the challenges there, which of course isn't going to be met, but it's almost impossible to meet it, but without more economic education. But one of the challenges there is that the average homeowner and the average user of employer-subsidized health care sees the benefits. It's much harder to see the costs of that policy. So the political incentives for fixing that are very small. The strange thing is that, and this is a thing that worries me that I don't hear much about, we're moving to a system where the opposite of what you said, which you said the ideal system is you lower the rate and you broaden the base. We keep narrowing the base because politically it's always good to pay off folks and tell them they don't have to pay any taxes. So the income tax is increasingly paid by a smaller percentage of the public at large. Now there's a illusion inside there, which is that the payroll tax, which is supposedly financing Social Security, isn't financing Social Security, it's financing general expenditures. There's a terrible ruse and a deception going on that started a long time ago that most people don't notice, which is that their so-called Social Security taxes finance anything that government does. But if you just look at the income tax, for political purposes, the proportion of income tax paid by the bottom half of the population is tiny. And what that leads to is a demand for government. Because the political economy of that is what I worry about, that it creates a demand for government by a large segment of the population whose share of an additional dollar is incredibly small. So strangely enough, they want additional dollars. Do you worry about that?
Yes, to some extent I do, and it raises the question of what is the optimal progressivity of the tax system. It's actually an issue that I think the economists don't have a monopoly on. I mean, it's a question that involves as much issues of political philosophy as it does economics. I mean, to some extent it's economics and what are the distortionary effects of taxes, how do higher tax rates shrink the size of the economic pie, but also depends on one's fundamental political philosophy. That is, when you read John Rawls and Robert Nozick, which political philosopher more appeals to you? The followers of John Rawls aren't as bothered by the fact that the people at the bottom are paying any income tax, and indeed would be happy to sort of expand the earned income tax credit in order to lift the people at the bottom up. Followers of Robert Nozick are far fundamentally more libertarian and don't think it's a role for the federal government to correct the distribution of income. But those fundamental questions of political philosophy, in some sense, are beyond the scope of economics. And when I teach students, freshmen, we go through the different arguments, and I talk about both Rawls and Nozick as different philosophers. But I say, at the end of the day, not all of economic policy is about economics. Some of it's about one's basic view of what the role of government should be.
Absolutely. But even within that political philosophy debate, and I'm not only more sympathetic to Nozick, I'd certainly rather read him on any given day than Rawls. I wonder how many people in the world alive today have read the entire Theory of Justice word for word. I would not be in that group. Although I own it, and I have looked through it. I've read many pages, many individual words. But I've read all of Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which that's a wonderful book, both in terms of content and style. But even within that debate, economics does play a role in the following sense, and I think Rawls clearly understood this, and I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. Economics plays a role in the following sense. If you think philosophically the government has a role in helping the least well-off among us, you should still worry about the incentive effects and the overall well-being of those folks, both now and in the future, and in their children's lives and their grandchildren's lives, if the means of redistribution is so destructive that it only produces a short-term benefit and a lot of long-term harm. And I think that's where economics does have a role to play in that political philosophy debate. I think societies that have embraced the Rawlsian view, at least on paper, have not served the lowest members of the economic distribution particularly well. They have claimed to, but that doesn't often work out very well.
I think that's right, and I think it's in part because people who design social programs are often engaging in wishful thinking, hoping that their programs are not going to have adverse incentive effects, or that the adverse incentive effects will not lead to a lot of perverse behavior. Whereas, in fact, over time, as we study these programs, we realize people really do respond to incentives, and those incentive effects are really quite important for the design of programs, which is why you even had a liberal Democratic president like Bill Clinton endorse what looks like a very conservative welfare reform bill in 1996, precisely because he was cognizant of the adverse incentive effects of such programs.
I hope you're right. That's always a possibility, that a politician endorses something because he thinks it's a good thing, as opposed to the more cynical view that he endorses it because he thinks it'll keep him in power. But let's move to a more speculative policy that you've been advocating, which is the Pigou Club. Pigou is spelled Pigou for the listeners out there. Tell us who Pigou was and what's the club about.
Oh, yeah. Arthur Pigou was a famous 19th century British economist, roughly a contemporary of Keynes. And one of the ideas that he had, which is why the Pigou Club is called the Pigou Club, is to use taxes as a way of correcting what economists call externalities, that is, spillover effects from certain activities. So, if, for example, if driving and burning gasoline emits certain pollution, the one way to deal with that pollution and to encourage people to not overdrive and not emit too much pollution would be to, say, tax gasoline or tax hydrocarbons more broadly. So what Pigou basically said is we should use taxes in order to correct certain forms of market failures. So the Pigou Club is really just a rhetorical device that I've created on my blog, of basically listing a variety of economists and other commentators who have publicly advocated higher Pigouvian taxes, such as higher gasoline taxes or a carbon tax, in order to deal with global warming. And if you look at the list, the list includes quite a large number of prominent economists and commentators, including people of both the right and the left. So you have people like Larry Summers and Alan Greenspan, for example, who have both at some point endorsed higher gasoline taxes as a way to both raise government revenue and to correct market failures associated with externalities.
Well, just a brief anecdote. My memory of Pigou, I think this is a true story. Maybe one of our listeners can verify it, or maybe you can, Greg. But my memory is that Pigou was a student of Marshall, Alfred Marshall, and that I was told that when he was literally a student, when he was a student in Marshall's lectures, that he was the only student. That Marshall would come in, put his notes down on the lectern, and start reading as Pigou sat in the front row by himself, listening to the master. Have you ever heard that story?
No, I did not know that.
I don't know if it's true. It's a good story. In fact, it might be the case that in one of the versions I heard, there were two students to start with. One of them dropped out. Maybe it was just too surreal for him, and that left A.C. Pigou, young Arthur, sitting there scribbling furiously, no doubt. But let's talk about this tax. Make the case for it. You talk about externalities. So an externality would be an example where your actions impose a negative externality. Would be an example where your actions impose harmful effects on others that you don't have to bear, and therefore, in economics, we'd argue that things that produce negative externalities get overdone because you don't bear the full cost. Things that produce positive externalities are underdone and not done in a sufficient amount. So the Pigouvian world, that's the adjective for Pigou, the Pigouvian world is one where we want to tax negative externalities and subsidize positive externalities. So in your opinion, what are the negative externalities associated with gasoline that would merit such a tax?
Well, I think there's a variety of them. Part of them is environmental. I mean, gasoline does emit a variety of pollutants. Gasoline emits, for example, our carbon dioxide, and carbon is often viewed to be a cause of global warming. Now, in the scientific debate over global warming, I have no comparative advantage, so I won't even opine. But to the extent that one is worried about global warming and carbon emission, the most natural thing to do is to tax things that emit carbon, such as gasoline. But in addition to pollution, the other sort of externality associated with driving is congestion. I live in a major metropolitan area in the Boston area, and I spend lots of time sitting in traffic. It's going very slowly because lots of other people on the road. So basically, every time anyone decides to drive somewhere, drive to work, drive to the grocery store, they're conveying a negative externality to everyone else because they're adding to road congestion and slowing everyone else down. And that road congestion is a form of externality that can be dealt with indirectly through a gasoline tax. Now, a more direct way to deal with road congestion would be road pricing. Whereas if we had all these, if we had level fast passes in all our cars and all roads were had readers, you could actually charge people explicitly when they drove on congested roads, and not charge them when they drove on less congested roads. That would be sort of a first best way of dealing with congestion externalities. So a gasoline tax is a sort of second best way of dealing with those congestion externalities in the absence of sort of road pricing.
Yeah, the problem with the road pricing is that the externality is borne by the people who are causing it, unlike a traditional externality. It's true that when you get on the road, you slow everybody else down, but you're also going a little slower than the previous drivers. So when you put that tax on, to reduce people's driving, you've got to make it more expensive to drive, which means that essentially you have to take resources away from drivers. Now, they do get in return less congestion, but it has to be the case, at least at the margin, and it could be the case for most or many drivers, that you have to make them worse off from driving. And so the political economy of that I've always viewed as a very unlikely policy change. It has been implemented.
Well, the question is what you do with the revenue.
Right, exactly. And
the
economists
one of my goals is to use the revenue in order to lower other taxes, or so the other taxes won't have to go up as much. I mean, we have a long-term fiscal gap, so either spending, as we talked about earlier, is going to go down, or taxes are going to go up. And to the extent that taxes are going to go up, I'd rather have them be relatively efficient taxes, like a Pigouvian tax.
But see, that's one of the reasons I'm not a member of the club yet. I'm open-minded, Greg. You have at least 5 or 10 minutes here to change my mind and any of our listeners. One of the things I worry about, and I'll come to a couple other worries I have, but one of the things I worry about is that that's a nice thought, that we would use it to substitute for other taxes. Is it reasonable? Milton Friedman has said, I think many times, I've never met a tax cut I didn't like. I think the corollary to that, I've never heard him say this, but I think a corollary to that would be I've never met a tax increase that I liked. And I think his skepticism about that would be that tax increases are not then in turn lead to tax reductions. They just lead to spending increases in line with our previous discussion. Do you have any reason to think that would be any different in this case?
Well, we have cut taxes, so this idea that one can never cut taxes, I think, is clearly not right. President Bush did cut taxes quite substantially in 2001 and 2003. So I don't think it's impossible. If you have the view that all tax increases are bad, and you just leave your conclusion at that, then you're basically in a position as an economist where you say, I can't judge one tax versus another tax. And it seems to me we need a somewhat more subtle economic analysis that be able to tell policymakers, some taxes are better than other taxes. And when thinking about how we're going to raise money for the government, let's use the good taxes and not the bad taxes. So if you're not a member, if you're not a member of the Pigou Club because you think you don't like tax increases, then it sort of puts you in a box of saying anything that has word tax in it is bad, and then you're leaving the debate to how the government should raise its revenue to non-economists.
Well, let me try to defend my position a little bit more subtly then. Give you another chance to whack at me. If we raise gasoline taxes in the hopes that we would reduce taxes somewhere else, I would argue that would not be the case. That what we will end up doing is spending more, which is exactly what we have been doing steadily for a long time, so that what appear to be tax cuts, that is reductions in tax rates in the short term, are not particularly likely to lead to long-term tax reductions unless we find a way to rein in spending. And since a rise in the gasoline tax would add to the pile of stuff that government gets to play with, I would like to take away that piece of the sandbox.
Well, it depends how the bill was written. I mean, let's suppose the bill was written saying we're going to slowly increase the gasoline tax, say 10 cents per year until it reaches $1, $1.50 or something. And at the same time, we're going to make the tax cuts that President Bush passed into law, which now expire, I believe, in 2010, if I recall. We're going to make those permanent. And let's imagine we jiggle the numbers in a way that bill is revenue neutral. Would you be in favor of that?
Well, we're getting closer. That would be good. That would be better than just raising the gasoline tax.
Oh, no, I understand. Yeah, I think it has to be done in the context of a more comprehensive tax bill that deals with how the revenue is going to be used. My
other hesitancy, and I'll give you a chance to respond. My other hesitancy is two issues. As you said a while back, we want to lower rates and broaden the base. When we start taxing individual products as a source of revenue, I think the politics of that is very destructive and it is likely to lead to a great deal of mischief. Once we argue as economists that it's good on efficiency grounds, say, to tax gasoline higher than it already is taxed, well then, what about other products? Shouldn't each product, according to Pigou, bear its own efficient tax rate? And then what ultimately happens is that you don't get the efficient tax rate. You get the politically designed tax rate. And you've admitted as much in your work, and you have to, that we don't really know precisely what the optimal tax rate is on gasoline or whiskey or cards or whatever else people decide are harmful. Tobacco would be an obvious another example. And then I look at the tobacco case and the politics of the tobacco settlement. Actually, I think there's a good argument for subsidizing tobacco on pure externality grounds, on the budgetary externalities, which is, I think, theoretically incorrect. That people look at budgetary externalities as a justification for taxation. But if you do look at them, tobacco kills people early and quickly relative to some other things. That saves people health care costs that are subsidized. It saves Social Security payments we talked about earlier. So you could actually make a case on so-called externality grounds that you should subsidize tobacco. But put that to the side. If there is a case, even for a positive tax on tobacco, the way that settlement's actually turned out, doesn't that give you some pause about that Pigouvian tax on gasoline?
Well, I think sure. I think the political process is always a risk that they're going to get things wrong. But having economists come out against optimal Pigouvian taxes is not going to take politics out of the tax process. Politics is there inside the tax writing process. Having economists fail to advocate first best Pigouvian taxes is not going to help matters in that regard. So politics is absolutely there. The only thing I think economists can do is sort of acknowledge that and sort of call it like we see it. And if we think this is a good tax from the standpoint of economic efficiency, I think we shouldn't avoid saying that simply because we think, well, if I say this, all of a sudden the tax policy will be politicized. Well, tax policy is already politicized. That's just a fact of life. And what economists can do is say, here's our best advice, and not in some sense hide our best advice, because we somehow think that our best advice is going to make the world more political than otherwise would be. The world is political. That's just a fact. That's a fact of life, which is why we do have sort of a crazy tax system to a large extent.
Yeah,
so I think the best we can do as economists is sort of go to politicians, give them best advice, go to op-ed pages, tell voters what our best advice is, and persuade as many people as we can.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think it's a tough question. We've grappled with it a little bit in previous podcasts with your colleague Ed Glazer and with Richard Thaler. We talked about this concept of libertarian or soft paternalism as to whether you should take into account when you advocate for a policy what the political consequences of that advocacy would be. In this case, I understand the externality arguments for on the pollution side, potentially on the global warming side, if the science is correct, and for the advocates of that. But I think as economists, we would do best to describe those effects. Whether we should advocate them, I think we should take into account the likely political effects. But maybe that's a I think I've always wrestled in my own mind how to deal with political constraints as an economic advisor, because it's a tough one.
if you really say I'm going to take into account all political constraints, you end up recommending the status quo, because the status quo is the outcome of the process, given all the political constraints that everybody faces.
I think that's the George Stigler view of the world. I think George Stigler.
Therefore, you should sort of avoid making any recommendation
right.
at all.
Stigler's view, at least. This may be a caricature, but I don't think so. I think Stigler's view was the world is as it is because of the incentives that are in place already. Arguing for a different set of outcomes is quixotic. It's a waste of time. And as economists, we are scientists who observe the process in action, and trying to advocate a particular policy change would be like a physicist advocating a change in the law of gravity. But, of course, in the real world, economists do affect policy outcomes, and Stigler's counterpart was Milton Friedman, who took a much more idealistic or quixotic view of things. In the positive sense, he tilted at a lot of windmills, and some of them fell down. So, empirically, I think Stigler wasn't correct, although it's easy to delude ourselves into thinking that we influence things. When I interviewed Milton and asked him about the impacts of his ideas, he constantly said in a previous podcast that it was experience that was important in changing the world, not so much the intellectual environment. But I guess that's a debate that's very hard to parse accurately.
Well, I think it is right. And on this Milton Friedman versus Stigler divide, I'm much more on the Milton Friedman side. I'm willing to tilt at a few windmills, recognizing that it is largely a quixotic activity, and to be modest in what one's aspirations are going to be.
One more point on the Pigou tax idea. The impact of Ronald Coase on the profession, one of his most important contributions was to challenge the Pigouvian tax as a policy solution, and he did that in something that has come to be called the Coase Theorem, which is a strange way that it gets described, and I think his ideas, which is a sufficient way to describe it, Coase's ideas in his famous paper on social cost certainly challenged Pigou's ideas. And the way I would describe it in this case, and I'd like to get your reaction, I would describe it in this case as saying, okay, well, let's say carbon dioxide and other results of driving do lead to global warming. Whether we want to put a tax on or not to discourage driving and the burning of fossil fuels, whether we want to do that would depend on the costs of alternative ways of coping with global warming. So that if there were, to take just a silly, simple example, if global warming, if the main effect was to make us less comfortable because it was hot, then there are two ways to solve that problem. One is to put the tax on gasoline and discourage people from driving, if indeed that does lead to global warming. The second is to invest in air conditioning, which is another way to solve that hardship. Any traction there for you in being a little more skeptical about your own membership in the club?
Oh, I think that's right. There are a variety of different ways to optimally respond, and as a result, trying to figure out what the optimal carbon tax is tricky. I mean, the pure Coase Theorem, which is that markets can do it all by itself, you never need Pigouvian taxes of any sort, is of course applies only to a world with zero transactions costs.
A world that is unrealistic and that Coase himself said was unrealistic. It bothers me when people say that's what Coase said. That's one piece of it. The second part that Coase said, which I think is what I consider the Coase Theorem, to the extent it's a theorem, is that because transaction costs are not zero, be careful where you put liability, be careful where you put responsibility, be careful where you put property rights, and take into account the costs.
Well, exactly. No, I think it is tricky, and that's why it's hard to figure out what the optimal taxes are. And in that world with transactions costs, there's still a market failure that needs to be dealt with, but trying to figure it out is much more difficult. I heard one economist say, for example, that the optimal response to global warming is over a period of several generations will slowly migrate to Siberia. People have many ways to adapt to a changing environment, and I don't pretend to be an expert on global warming, so I have no idea what the optimal carbon tax is. I think some of the more concrete externalities, like congestion, I think are much easier to get your mind around because those are more easily estimated, and I think in much more concrete and less dependent on controversial science.
Yeah, the problem with the congestion one is the bluntness of the gasoline tax as a way to do that. For me, it's a much more compelling case for pollution generally, because clearly an extra mile of driving leads to a little more of various particulates in the air. But an extra mile of driving doesn't lead to more congestion if you manage to do it at 3 a.m. Here in Washington, D.C. or in Boston.
There's no question that's true. It's a perfect instrument.
But unfortunately,
the other thing to say about that is we're now using even worse instruments for other things. We have these corporate average fuel economy standards, which are incredibly regulatory, incredibly heavy-handed, replete with unintended consequences. And one of my goals of using things like gasoline taxes is to offer some regulatory relief, is to sort of do something that's less intrusive in the market than the heavy regulations we have of the auto industry right now.
Well, that'd be an interesting club. The club that said we'll raise gasoline taxes, we'll get rid of CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards. What else could we throw in there to get the skeptics on board? But I think that's a very that is an attractive.
There's a whole variety of arguments. So one of them is also the incidence argument. Some economists have argued that if we had higher gasoline taxes, a large fraction of that tax would be borne by the oil suppliers, not the oil consumers. As we know from basic economics, the instance of any tax is borne by both sides of the market to varying degrees. In this case, to the extent that we end up consuming less oil because of higher gasoline taxes, the price of oil in world markets will fall, and therefore part of the tax will in effect be paid by Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and the other countries that sell oil on world markets.
Yeah, it's an interesting. That's the argument, the equivalent argument for an optimal tariff in a world where you have some market power. That the risk there always is that you would set the rate incorrectly.
That's right.
So it is a tricky thing, but it's a very important point that there would be much more complex ramifications than merely a higher cost of driving. That's very important to remember. Interesting thing. Well, last question. if you were economic czar for the day, and you were an economic czar, but you were an economic czar in that political world we've been struggling with over the last few minutes, if you were an autocratic economic czar, and you could do put a variety of things in place, where's the lowest hanging fruit? Where, you've mentioned a gasoline tax is a possible example, but that might not be the lowest hanging fruit. If you could change some policies that we live under today, what would be the ones that you think would have the biggest bang for the buck? What would be as an economist, the improvements that you think we could put in place that would have the biggest impact, ignoring the political realism of the issues?
Well, let me mention a few. One would obviously be higher Pigouvian taxes, which we've talked about. Another would be basic tax reform, which we've alluded to. I think the President's panel on tax reform had a really great set of proposals, and I think either of those would be a big improvement. Either of the two proposals that they had would be a big improvement over current law. So I would be just pass one of those. Actually, the more radical of their two, which is very close to a sort of broad-based progressive consumption tax. And then I'd worry about entitlements for the elderly, and in particular, I'd phase in a very significant but very gradual increase in the retirement age with which people become eligible for Social Security and Medicare, in order to basically tell people, look, we're living longer, we're healthier in older ages, and therefore we shouldn't expect to go on the government dole at the same age that was true in your grandparents' day.
Given our wealth, isn't it strange that we expect to go on the government dole at all? As private savings have increased, as private participation in the stock market and other forms of saving have increased, it surprises me that the political traction for Social Security remains so strong. Right? Most of us are perfectly capable of taking care of ourselves. We live in incredibly productive times. We have an incredible standard of living, and the riskiness of life, despite some claims to the contrary, the riskiness of life is much, much lower than it was in 1870 or 1920 or 1950. And yet the political demand for that safety net for all of us remains. Do you find that strange? Do you think there's any hope that's going to change?
I guess I don't find it strange only because I've lived in the society that has had it. And I think that fundamentally we have it because in a world without the social safety net, most people would be fine. Most people would save for their retirement. Most people would manage to get health insurance through the private market, and most people would be fine. But some people wouldn't, and some people would either be unlucky or too impatient or too short-sighted and not provide for their own retirement. And we as a society aren't going to let that small percentage of the population starve in old age. And as a result of sort of that, the fact that we're very compassionate and we don't want the short-sighted, the formerly short-sighted 80-year-old to starve, we provide retirement benefits for basically all 80-year-olds. The problem is we don't need to do it for all 65-year-olds.
Yeah, such a strange way to do it.
Pardon me?
Such a strange way to do it, given that you're right. There's a group of people who, for all those reasons, would find themselves struggling, and our hearts would go out to them. We could then choose to help them through collective action in the political process or private voluntary action. And instead we've but the system that has emerged is a collective action that helps every person. It's got a tremendous amount of inertia about it, that system.
I think if you're starting the world from scratch in a state of nature without any political constraints, you might just institute some very general broad-based negative income tax along the lines that Milton Friedman proposed many, many years ago.
Sure.
And then once you had a floor in income through the negative income tax, you'd say that's enough. It's all we need for social safety net for people of any age. We wouldn't need anything else. But we're very far from that world.
We are. I think we're closer than we were 50 years ago, but we're still very far.
I think that's right.
Well, my guest today has been Greg Mankiw, professor of economics at Harvard University. He blogs at Greg Mankiw's blog. Greg, thanks for joining us today. Thank you.
It's been great talking to you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.